So when we talk about nutrition, it's the sixth or seventh chapter of Edexcel IGCSE biology. And by nutrition, the word nutrition, we know when we study the characteristics of living organism, Mrs. Grant, and the N meant nutrition. Now, nutrition is anything which the organism intakes for energy, for carrying out its life processes. And when we talk about living organisms, it includes both plants and animals. So this nutrition chapter is actually divided into two parts. One is nutrition in plants and one is nutrition in animals. So we're going to be studying this combined. It's a really long chapter. And in plant nutrition, we'll be covering photosynthesis and the structure of leaf and how do leaves produce their food and how do they carry out their life processes and nutrition. Then we'll be studying how nutrition in animals occur, how do they carry out their life processes with nutrition, and which will include the whole digestive system, most importantly. And so let's begin with the chapter. So the first part of the chapter, this chapter, as I told you, divided into two parts. One is nutrition in plants, and the other one is nutrition in animals. Now we all know how do plants take in food. How do they basically make their own food, and that is done by the process which is known as photosynthesis. We all know that the basics. So what is photosynthesis? So photosynthesis is an endothermic reaction in which energy from sunlight is transferred to the chloroplasts in green plants. Now we all know that in cell structure we studied an organelle inside plant cells which is known as chloroplast. So this chloroplast is actually responsible for absorbing the sunlight. Why? Because it's having a pigment known as chlorophyll. Now these chloroplasts are present inside plant cells and these plant cells are present inside these leaves. So the green color of the leaf is given by the substance chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is also present in chloroplast responsible for trapping light energy. Now the term endothermic reaction means absorbing heat. All right, so endothermic, you have to remember, you will be studying in chemistry. I don't know if you studied or not, the energy from chemicals chapter, in which we discussed two types of chemical reactions. One is exothermic and the other is endothermic. Exothermic reactions are in which energy is released and the heat is released, for example, combustion. Then we have photosynthesis, which is an endothermic reaction, which we absorb heat and then use it to further process the nutrition. Now, green plants use this energy to make the carbohydrate glucose from the raw materials carbon dioxide and water. So the question we once studied that plants use carbon dioxide and water to make glucose. Now the formula of glucose was C6H12O6, and one of the other byproducts and the main products is oxygen. So this is the equation of photosynthesis, very important. In Edexcel papers, it is mostly for 2 marks. Write a balanced equation for photosynthesis. Now, if you want to balance it, it's something like this: 6CO2 plus 6H2O and 6O2, and this would still remain 1 mole. So we have 6CO2 plus 6H2O, which forms 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. At the same time, oxygen is made and released as a waste product. So oxygen is the waste product. Okay, it is released in the environment due to transpiration, and that oxygen is now absorbed by us animals and humans. So basically, photosynthesis is an endothermic reaction. We use the plants use sunlight for photosynthesis. How is the light energy trapped? By chloroplast. Chloroplasts are present in plant cells and they have a substance known as chlorophyll, which gives the plant a green color. They use the light energy to carry out photosynthesis. Now you have to remember the reactants of photosynthesis and products. So we have CO2 and H2O as the reactants, and we have glucose and oxygen as the products. Oxygen is a byproduct, also known as a waste product, which is then afterwards transported out of the plant. So you can see there's a diagram of plant. carbohydrates produced inside the leaf, water is absorbed by the roots, or more specifically, root hair cells are actually responsible for absorbing water through osmosis, as we studied in the last chapter. Carbon dioxide is absorbed by the stomata. We will be studying what is stomata in transpiration and transport in plants. Light energy, is absorbed by the sun, and oxygen is released out of the plant. Then we have a term known as photosynthesis theory. Now, theory is actually the definition. What do scientists usually call photosynthesis? Which process do they define as photosynthesis? So photosynthesis can be defined as the process by which plants manufacture, make, produce, synthesize, manufacture carbohydrates from raw materials. Now, those raw materials were CO2 and water, H2O, using energy, and this energy was in the form of light. So you see the raw materials are CO2, H2O, and light energy. These are the raw materials needed for photosynthesis to occur, and the products will include glucose and oxygen. Now there are two types of plants when we talk about photosynthesis. The first type is called autotrophs, and the second one is producers. Now, autotrophs are the plants. They can make complex molecules, for example, glucose or starch or cellulose, from simple molecules, which are carbon dioxide and water. So basically, autotrophs can make glucose from simple molecules, and those simple molecules are the basic raw materials of photosynthesis, which we just discussed, CO2 and water. Now, what are producers? They can make their own food, all right, and so are the first organism at start of all food chains. Now, when we'll be studying the chapter of the food chains, which is chapter number 19 or 20, in food chain, we have a list that we'll study carnivores, we'll study producers, herbivores, and then there's a whole chain that how do organisms take in nutrients by each other, by hunting each other down, and how is the natural selection also. Producer is basically they make their own food, and they are the first organism at the start of all food chain. For example, an animal would eat those producer plants, then another animal, a larger animal, might eat that animal which ate the producer, and so the chain goes on. But the chain is started by these producers. This producer might be a normal plant, which is eaten by a bird, and that bird is eaten by a animal. Plants use the glucose they make as a source of energy in respiration. Now, plants actually need that glucose to carry out respiration. They can also use it to produce starch for storage, as we know that in plants we have starch as the storage. But when we talk about animals, we have glycogen as the storage molecule. You need to remember this. It can be asked in the form of a MCQ. So starch is the storage in plants and glycogen is the storage in animals. So glucose, of course, we know glucose is a monosaccharide, and monosaccharides can be further joined together in plants to form a large polysaccharide known as starch. Or they can use the glucose to synthesize lipids for an energy source in seeds. Now, lipids, as we studied in biological molecules, are the main source of energy. They have the highest energy because of the double bonds, because of the oxygen, because of the high amount of fatty acid chains and glycerol. They are the most heaviest energy providing biological molecules. Lipids contain the highest amount of energy than carbohydrates and proteins. Hence, that's why plants usually convert those carbohydrates or glucose into lipids for an energy source in seeds. Of course, the seeds they contain legumes, they contain a shoot, and a seed needs to develop time by time. We'll be studying how, and they need actually energy to develop. Or what can they use glucose for? They can form cellulose to make cell walls. Now, glucose again is a monosaccharide. Starch and cellulose, they're both polysaccharides. Okay, so glucose can further be converted into starch or it can be converted into cellulose. Now, starch is used for storage and cellulose over here is used for cell walls. So now you know where are the products of photosynthesis being used inside the plants. If the examiner asks you that where is the glucose required inside plants, so you can say you have two answers indeed, that glucose can be converted into starch for storage material, or it can be converted into cellulose to make cell walls. Also, glucose can be converted to produce amino acids, which is used to make protein when combined with nitrogen and other mineral ions absorbed by the roots. Of course, when glucose would be combined with nitrogen and other ions, it would form amino acids. And those amino acids can further form protein chains. Hence, you see that glucose has actually been converted either into polysaccharides of carbohydrates, or it is being converted into another biological molecules, either lipids or proteins, or they may remain carbohydrates, but they take another form. Instead of a monosaccharide, they take a form of polysaccharides. So glucose can be converted into starch, cellulose, lipids, and amino acids. And amino acids can further be used to make proteins or synthesize proteins on ribosomes. So we have the molecule of starch. So we have glucose over here. Now glucose can be converted into sucrose for transport around the plant. The first function of glucose. It can be combined with the nitrates from the soil. Now nitrates contain NO2 or NO3, and they would further form amino acids, the second function of glucose. Or they can be converted into fats plus oils for energy storage in seeds, meaning they can be converted into lipids. We are still talking about the products of photosynthesis. Glucose is a product of photosynthesis, which is further used in so many things. Or glucose can be used in respiration to release energy. So this was the third function, and this was the fourth function. Moreover, glucose can be converted into cellulose for cell wall. It can be converted into starch for storage. Hence, starch is actually an insoluble molecule which won't affect osmosis in cells. So we have, right now you have to remember the 6 functions of the products of photosynthesis. The first one is converted into sucrose for transportation. Secondly, amino acids used to make proteins. Thirdly, it can be converted into lipids. Number 4, it can be used in respiration to release energy. Number 5, it can be converted into cellulose for cell wall. And number 6, glucose can be converted into starch for storage. Got it?
Yes, sir.
Moving on. The equation of photosynthesis, we know we have carbon dioxide, we have water. Light energy is absorbed by the chloroplasts, or more simpler, chlorophyll inside those chloroplasts, which is then used to make glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen as a waste product. So if they ask you for a chemical equation, you can write CO2 plus H2O forms C6H12O6 plus O2. If they ask you for a word equation, you can write carbon dioxide plus water forming glucose plus oxygen. If they ask you for a balance equation, you can write 6CO2 plus 6H2O forming C6H12O6 plus 6O2. This is the equation of photosynthesis. If we reverse this equation, it becomes the equation for respiration. That would be oxygen plus glucose forming water and carbon dioxide plus some energy also in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now we have carbon dioxide. Now we're going to be seeing that how are these substances actually transported in or out of the plant? Where do they actually come from? So the carbon dioxide diffuses into the leaf through the stomata. So we have a leaf which usually have these tiny openings known as stomatas. Now the CO2 is actually present around the environment, the CO2 diffuses inside the leaf. How does it diffuses? Because there's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide outside and lower concentration of carbon dioxide inside. Hence, we studied in the previous chapter, movement in and out of the cells. The diffusion takes place from a higher concentration to a lower concentration down the concentration gradient without the use of energy. Hence, CO2 diffuses into the leaf from the environment through diffusion. Now, where does the water come from? The water we actually studied is taken up by the root hair cells present in roots and are transported through xylem. Now, xylem and phloem are two vessels. We will be studying that in detail in transport in plants. Xylem is actually responsible for the transport of water, whereas we have another thing known as phloem too, which is responsible for the transport of food in plants. Right now, you need to know how is water absorbed. We know where does carbon dioxide come from? From the environment through diffusion stomata. The water comes from the soil, of course, through root hair cells through osmosis. They are taken up by the roots. How? Because there's a higher water potential in the soil, lower water potential inside the root hair cells. Hence, the water diffuses or through osmosis comes inside the roots and is transported through the xylem to the leaves. Of course, when we have a plant, we have the roots over here. We have the leaf over here. The water is actually absorbed by the roots. Now, the photosynthesis is not taking place inside the roots. The photosynthesis takes place inside the leaves. So the water is now transported from the roots to the leaves through xylem vessels. Now, where does the glucose go after the photosynthesis? It is used to make substances needed by the plant, used in respiration to release energy. Used to make substances needed by the plant, we have studied how many substances. We have starch. The glucose may be used to make starch or cellulose or amino acids, which would make proteins, or they can be converted into lipids for energy, or they can be used in respiration to release energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate molecules, which is further used in many chemical reactions. Without ATP, most of the chemical reaction in both plants and animals cannot take place. Now, what happens to the oxygen? Now, oxygen diffuses out of the leaf through stomata. We again have the leaf, have tiny openings known as stomata. Now, there's a higher concentration of oxygen inside and a lower concentration outside. Of course, the oxygen would now be as a waste product which would diffuse out of the leaf, and that oxygen is actually inhaled by us humans. We again have a balanced equation. This equation can also be shown as a balanced chemical equation. This is what I was telling about. If the examiner asks you about a balanced chemical equation, we have 6 carbon dioxide molecules combined with 6 water molecules to make 1 glucose molecules and 6 oxygen molecules. So we have 6 CO2s, 6 H2O, and 6 O2. Remember, it is not producing 6 molecules of glucose. It is only producing 1 molecule of glucose. For example, if we take, now you answer me, if we take 12 molecules of CO2, 12 molecules of H2O, how many molecules of glucose will be produced then? It would be 2.
Yeah, 2. And then 12 oxygen?
Yeah, of course. If according to chemistry we calculate the moles, this is how the ratio goes. The ratio was 6 ratio 6 ratio 1 ratio 6. Hence, if you see, if we double the amount of carbon dioxide in water, the glucose amount would be doubled. Same is the case with the waste product oxygen. This is the balanced equation. If they ask you for a word equation, remember to write full form word: carbon dioxide plus WATER, water, then write the full form of glucose, GLUCOSE, and oxygen. And you can write oxygen is the waste product. The raw materials, if they ask you about the raw materials and reactants are the same things. And products, you know, glucose and oxygen.